late 1970s saw the beginning of a long-running series of bright, cheerful ads promoting the premier hamburger sandwich of the McDonald's menu, the Big Mac, with warnings about hungry people having Big Mac attacks. They were cheerfully informed that the only satisfying cure for this attack was to hustle to the nearest McDonald's restaurant and order a Big Mac from the smiling employee at the counter. The story I am about to share in this episode of the Strange Brew Series is about a Big Mac attack, but not the burger kind of the 1970s. It's about a much earlier, much darker, decidedly uncheerful Mac attack with a much less satisfying solution. General Douglas MacArthur had been personally overseeing the preparations for the sneak attack for some time. When the day came, he was at the front, watching over the progress of the tanks and the troops, relentlessly moving forward in gas masks, with their rifles, bayonets, swords, and tear gas grenades at the ready. The enemy was routed in chaos before them, fleeing across the river. For a time, the general had his troops stand down. Word came from the president, "Do not cross the river and engage the opposition again at this time. There were too many dangers in that tactic." The president sent word twice through leading military men, "Stay where you are until further orders." But from MacArthur's point of view, the president was not there to evaluate the situation clearly. MacArthur, infinitely sure of himself because of his long experience in the field, ignored the orders, and by the end of the day his troops had crossed that river and attacked. And most Americans familiar with history know the ultimate outcome of that level of insubordination. Or do we? Aren't we speaking here of General Douglas MacArthur in 1950, in North Korea attacking North Korean and Chinese troops, defying the directives of his commander-in-chief, President Harry S. Truman? No, we are speaking here of General Douglas MacArthur in 1932 in Washington, D.C., attacking over 20,000 U.S. Army veterans of World War I and hundreds of wives and children of some of them, defying the directives of his commander-in-chief, President Herbert Hoover. And therein is a story most Americans are totally unfamiliar with. Washington, D.C. Chief of Police Pelham D. Glassford was driving south through New Jersey the night of May 21st, 1932. Suddenly, a sight appeared in his headlights that he later described as a bedraggled group of 75 or 100 men and women marching cheerily along, singing and waving at the passing traffic. One man carried an American flag and another a banner that read, "Bonus or a job." Glassford pulled over to have a word with the ragtag group. Atop one of the marchers' push carts, he noted an infant girl lay sleeping, nestled amid one family's clothes, oblivious to the ruckus. Glassford, who had been the youngest brigadier general in the Army in World War I, understood almost immediately who these wayfarers were. For 2 weeks or so, newspapers across the nation had begun carrying accounts of marchers bound for the nation's capital. The demonstrators were part of a growing delegation of veterans and their families heading to Washington to collect payment of the bonus promised 8 years before, in 1924, to soldiers who had served in the Great War. That year, wrangling over the federal budget had ordained that this compensation be deferred until 1945. Now, in 1932, the men, who called themselves the Bonus Army, were dubbing the deferred payment the Tombstone Bonus because, they said, many of them would be dead by the time the government paid it. The life expectancy of males in 1924 was 58.1 years, so this wasn't an unreasonable theory. It might pay out for the young men who were drafted into service in the Great War at age 21 or so, but by the end of that war they were drafting men ages 18 to 45, and another 2 million men of all ages volunteered, no doubt many of them in their 30s and 40s. Plus, of course, a bonus that far in the future would not help men in staving off starvation for their families during the Great Depression. such as for this family with 5 stair-step children. The son, way in back, is pushing an infant in a baby buggy, the dad pulling a toddler in a wagon, walking the 120 miles on a bleak highway from one small Oklahoma town to another where he hoped to find work in 1938. He had lost the family farm during the severe Dust Bowl drought. At the same time, he was battling pneumonia. The family was not eligible for any kind of relief aid from the county where they lived. If he was due a bonus from World War I, but had to wait until 1945, his children might well all be dead by then. But back to Chief Glassford. Glassford drove on to Washington. By the time he got there, morning newspapers were carrying stories about the progress of the bonus army. The Washington Star reported that 100 unemployed World War veterans will leave Philadelphia tomorrow morning on a freight train for Washington, and that other vets were converging from as far away as Portland, Oregon, and the Middle West. Started by a single veteran named Walter Waters in Oregon, the ragtag movement grew very swiftly by word of mouth and newspaper to eventually consist of well over 25,000 veterans, accompanied by over 1,000 wives and children. Most of the men had been part of the World War I American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, sent to Europe to aid the Allies. They dubbed their new effort in 1932 the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or BEF. The chief was quick to grasp the logistical nightmare he faced. In 1932, nearly 32,000 businesses failed. Unemployment was up almost to 25%. 2 million people wandered the country looking for work, most with no success. Many of the homeless settled in communities of makeshift shacks called Hoovervilles after the president they blamed for their plight, like this huge Hooverville in Seattle. Glassford would need to create a sort of Hooverville of his own to house the thousands of mostly penniless bonus army men and their family members who were converging on Washington. But where? He chose a piece of land known as Anacostia Flats at the outer reaches of the District of Columbia, which could be reached from Capitol Hill, only 2 miles away, only by a wooden drawbridge that spanned the Anacostia River. Glassford did as much as he could to facilitate the establishment of the camp, making sure that at least a certain amount of building material, including piles of lumber and boxes of nails, were supplied. The veterans scavenged items to use in the building from a nearby dump and from nearby fields of straw, where they could get stuffing for mattresses to sleep on. The first contingent of Bonus Army marchers arrived May 23rd. Over the next 2 months, an estimated 25,000 more, many with wives and children, arrived to stake their claim to what they felt was their due. They came on foot or in rattletrap autos and trucks. Some even commandeered empty rail cars along the way. Evelyn Walsh McLean, 45, heiress to a Colorado mining fortune and owner of the famous Hope Diamond, had heard the trucks rumbling past her Massachusetts Avenue mansion in Washington. After 1 a.m. on a night soon after the vets began pouring into the city, she drove down to the Anacostia camp, where she came upon Chief Glassford, whom she had encountered socially as she moved among Washington's power elite, just on his way to buy coffee for the men. McLean drove with him to an all-night diner and told an awestruck counterman that she wanted 1,000 sandwiches and 1,000 packs of cigarettes. Glassford placed a similar order for coffee. "We too fed all the hungry ones who were in sight," McLean recalled later. Nothing I had seen before in my whole life touched me as deeply as what I had seen in the faces of the bonus army. When McLean learned that the marchers needed a headquarters tent, she had one delivered, along with books, radios, and cots. The main camp had more than 15,000 people, including about 1,100 wives and children. That made it the largest Hooverville in the country. The bonus marchers named it Camp Marks in honor of Police Captain S.J. Marks. He was head of the precinct that included the Anacostia area and was kind and helpful to the bonus army. The vets set up a barber shop and library, published their own newspaper that they called the BEF News, and even staged vaudeville shows where they sang such ditties as "My Bonus Lies Over the Ocean." A resident of D.C. named Charles Green lived a few blocks from the camp when he was in 8th grade. Decades later, he shared his memories of the Army. "We used to watch them build their shanties. They had their own MPs and officers in charge and flag-raising ceremonies, complete with a fellow playing bugle. We envied the youngsters because they weren't in school. Then some of the parents set up classrooms." Almost daily, Chief Glassford visited the camp riding a blue motorcycle. He arranged for volunteer physicians and medical corpsmen from a local Marine Corps Reserve unit to hold sick call twice a day. All the veterans, wrote syndicated Hearst columnist Floyd Gibbons, were down at the heel. All were slim and gaunt. There were empty sleeves from arms blown off in combat and limping men with canes. James G. Banks, also 82 and a pal of Green's, remembers that neighborhood people took meals down to the camp. The veterans were welcomed. Far from feeling threatened, most residents saw bonus marchers as something of a curiosity. On Saturdays and Sundays, a lot of tourists came down here, says Banks. Frank A. Taylor, 99 in 2003, had just gone to work that summer as a junior curator at the Smithsonian's Arts and Industries Building. In 1964, he would become the founding director of the Smithsonian's Museum of History and Technology, now the National Museum of American History. People in Washington were quite sympathetic to them, Taylor remembers. They were very orderly and came in to use the restrooms. We did ask that they not do any bathing or shaving before the museum opened. While newspaper reporters produced almost daily dispatches on camp life, they largely missed the biggest story of all. In this southern city, where schools, buses, and movies remained segregated, bonus army blacks and whites were living, working, eating, and playing together. Jim Banks, the grandson of a slave, looks back on the camp as the first massive integrated effort that I could remember. Roy Wilkins, the civil rights activist who in 1932 wrote about the camps for The Crisis, the NAACP Monthly, noted that there was one absentee in the bonus army, James Crow. Organizer Walter Waters went to great efforts to organize a temporary encampment for the BEF men and families that was respectable, safe, and orderly. The camp had the support of much of Washington. Locals brought them much-needed supplies, from sleeping bags to vegetables to cigarettes. Before long, the camp came to resemble a small city, with named streets. There were strict camp rules prohibiting alcohol, weapons, fighting, and begging. Some historians note that those veterans wanting to be a part of Camp Marks were required to register and prove they had been honorably discharged. The majority of veterans wanted their motives to be unambiguous, so communists were not allowed. American flags were seen waving over the tents and mud throughout the camp. In addition to Camp Marks, which ultimately held over 20,000, which was across the Anacostia River from the main part of D.C., another 8,000 or so set up smaller camps in empty lots and in and around abandoned buildings throughout the city of Washington. The main group of those occupied some abandoned buildings slated for demolition right on Pennsylvania Avenue near the Capitol building. Although the main BEF group of marchers rejected any connection with communist agitators, there was a small rival group in its own camp also demanding their bonuses that identified itself specifically as communist. But of course, all these men had arrived not just to have a huge social campout. The main reason they had made the long trek to Washington was to lobby Congress to pass a measure to pay them their war bonus. Within days of his arrival, Walter Waters had a full-blown lobbying operation underway. On June 4th, the BEF marched in full force down the streets of Washington. Veterans filled the representatives' waiting rooms, while others gathered outside the Capitol building. On June 14th, the bonus bill, opposed by Republicans loyal to President Hoover, came to the floor. When Congressman Edward E. Eslick, Democrat of Tennessee, was speaking in support of the bill, he suddenly fell dead from a heart attack. Thousands of Bonus Army veterans marched in his funeral procession, while Congress adjourned out of respect. The following day, June 15th, the House of Representatives passed the bonus bill by a vote of 211 to 176. Two days later, about 8,000 veterans gathered at the Capitol, expecting the Senate to pass the bill. Police had raised the drawbridge over the river that led to the 10,000 or so who were staying in the Anacostia camp, leaving them unable to join the rest of the veterans. The Senate debate on the bill continued on into the evening. About 9:30, Senate aides asked Walter Waters to come inside. He returned moments later to break the news to the crowd. The bill had been defeated. There were fears that at that point the veterans might storm the Capitol building, but it never happened. Instead, at the suggestion of a reporter, Waters asked the veterans to sing "America." They did, and when the song was over, they slowly filed back to their campsites. As the days went by after that, many bonus marchers dispersed back across the country to where they came from. But Waters and 20,000 others refused to give up. They declared their intention to stay here until 1945 if necessary to get our bonus. And thus demonstrations continued. In a July 13th demonstration, Police Chief Glassford addressed a rally on the Capitol grounds. As shown here, he asked the veterans to raise their hands if they had served in France and were 100% American. The reality was, no doubt, that many of these men had no home to go back to, and they hadn't left jobs to make the trip. If they had jobs, there would have been no desperate need for the bonus. As the caption on many of the protest signs said, bonus or jobs. If they had went back to where they came from, where there had been no jobs in the first place, they and their families had nothing to look forward to but begging or hunger, or outright starvation. It is thus understandable why many clung on to what, in hindsight now, was a fruitless hope that if they stayed, their plight would somehow change the mind of the government. But it didn't. As the weeks passed, conditions at the camp worsened. Evelyn Walsh McLean contacted Vice President Charles Curtis, who had attended dinner parties at her mansion. Unless something is done for these men, there's bound to be a lot of trouble, she told him. McLean's efforts backfired. Vice President Curtis became paranoid when he saw veterans near his Capitol Hill office on the anniversary of the day the mob stormed France's Bastille. President Hoover, Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, and Secretary of War Patrick J. Hurley increasingly feared that the bonus army would turn violent and trigger uprisings in Washington and elsewhere. Hoover was especially troubled by the veterans who occupied abandoned buildings downtown. And thus we come to that infamous scenario described in the beginning of this story. Secretary of War Hurley became totally impatient with the standoff by July 28th and ordered Police Chief Glassford to use his police force to evict the bonus army men who had been camping in and around the abandoned buildings near the Capitol. The veterans refused to cooperate. They had no firearms, but they did start throwing rocks and bricks at the police. Fearing for their safety, the police opened fire with their weapons. One veteran was killed instantly, another soon died from wounds, and from that point on, the situation escalated out of control. The police retreated, and Glassford's superiors called the president to send federal troops to restore order. Hoover had been waiting for just such an opening. He had Hurley send the following orders to MacArthur. You will have United States troops proceed immediately to the scene of the disorder, surround the affected area, and clear it without delay. Any women and children should be accorded every consideration and kindness. Use all humanity consistent with the execution of this order. Unfortunately, General MacArthur had a bit more in mind than just briskly carrying out the limited order about clearing downtown D.C. Not surprisingly, MacArthur now executed his orders in a manner seemingly designed to maximize media attention. In a highly unusual but characteristic decision, one purportedly against the advice of his aide, 42-year-old Major Dwight Eisenhower, he chose to oversee the operations in the field with the troops. Military protocol called for a commanding officer to remain at headquarters. This was especially true for MacArthur, whose post was administrative rather than operational. So while he charged General Perry Miles with carrying out the eviction, MacArthur assumed the real responsibility. Although no other situation offers an exact comparison, MacArthur's action was as if General Maxwell Taylor, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1963, had led National Guard troops to the University of Alabama to confront Alabama Governor George Wallace. During the military operation, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, later the 34th President of the United States, served as one of MacArthur's junior aides. Believing it wrong for the Army's highest-ranking officer to lead an action against fellow American war veterans, he strongly advised MacArthur against taking any public role. In fact, in an interview much later with historian Stephen Ambrose, Eisenhower recalled the Bonus Army incident. He told Ambrose, "I told that dumb son of a bitch that he had no business going down there." But of course, part of MacArthur's business was to put on a personal spectacle, and he couldn't do that from a desk. Yes, none of this was left to chance. MacArthur had actually been planning this dramatic moment for many weeks and obviously intended to milk the drama for all it was worth. For 2 months, he had been secretly training his troops in methods of riot control. He was ready and waiting on orders to come from the president. As soon as they arrived, he commanded troops from Fort Myer, Virginia, to cross the Potomac River and assemble on the Ellipse, the grassy lawn across from the White House. What happened next was an unforgettable moment for America. For the first time in the nation's history, tanks rolled through the streets of the Capitol. MacArthur ordered his men to clear the downtown of veterans. At 4:30 p.m., nearly 200 soldiers mounted on horseback, with their sabers drawn and pennants flying, rode in formation out of the Ellipse. At the head of this contingent rode their executive officer, George S. Patton, followed by 5 tanks and about 300 helmeted infantrymen brandishing loaded rifles with fixed bayonets. The cavalry drove most pedestrians, curious onlookers, civil servants, and members of the Bonus Army, many with wives and children, off the streets. Infantrymen wearing gas masks hurled hundreds of tear gas grenades at the dispersing crowd. The detonated grenades set off dozens of fires. The flimsy shelters veterans had erected near the armory went up in flames. Black clouds mingled with tear gas. Oh, and about that tear gas, we are not talking here of something that just made your eyes sting and water. Nor was it the sort of chemical used in riot control in the 21st century. That stuff is nasty and harmful, but can't hold a candle to what MacArthur's troops used on the Bonus Army veterans and their families. It was a chemical called Adamsite, or DM, and it was from a stockpile left over from its use in the trenches in the Great War. Adamsite is usually dispersed as an aerosol, making the upper respiratory tract the primary site of action. Although the effects are similar to those caused by typical riot control agents, they are slower in onset but longer in duration, often lasting for 12 or more hours. After a latency period of 5 to 10 minutes, irritation of the eyes, lungs, and mucous membranes develops, followed by headache, nausea, and persistent vomiting. DM was produced and stockpiled by the British and the United States at the end of World War I. In the United States, it was used against the Bonus Army, who demonstrated in Washington, D.C. in 1932, reportedly causing the death and serious injury of several children who had accompanied their parents on the protests. It was again used in the Vietnam War. DM was allegedly used by Venezuelan authorities in the 2014-17 Venezuelan protest and described as a green gas, with reports of protesters vomiting following exposure and regional human rights groups condemning the use of green gas, stating that its usage is internationally banned. And in the midst of it all was Big Mac in his full regalia. As cavalry dispersed a group of outnumbered veterans waving a U.S. flag, a shocked bystander, his face streaked with tears from the gas, accosted MacArthur as he rode along in a staff car. "The American flag means nothing to me after this," the man yelled. The general quieted him with a stern rebuke. "Put that man under arrest if he opens his mouth again." The energetic officer was in his element. One reporter observed, "General MacArthur, his chest glittering with medals, strode up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, flipping a riding crop against his neatly pressed breeches." Some reports put the total crowd that had been on the streets in D.C. that day as 8,000 spectators and 2,000 bonus marchers, including some of their wives and children. By 7 p.m., the crowds were totally dispersed and the encampments evacuated and the remnants of housing and possessions smashed and torched. Black and white still photos of these events give just a very vague glimpse of the drama. To get just a bit more gut-level feel for what it would have been like to be there, here are just a few short clips of newsreel footage of the traumatic events.
At the end of May 1932, nearly 10,000 bonus marchers occupied the nation's capital, and tens of thousands more were on their way.
Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
What that brought you to Washington?
Well, to beat the Undertaker, spend the money before the Undertaker gets it.
I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me, this is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure American.
On July 16th, the last day Congress was in session, Washington was on edge. Thousands of angry veterans surrounded the Capitol. Near midnight, the 72nd Congress adjourned. Congressmen left through back doors and underground tunnels to avoid confrontations. The situation had come to a head. The president ordered the evacuation of the veterans from downtown Washington.
Now you bring in the troops.
The force stepped off at 4:30 p.m. More than 200 cavalrymen spread out across Constitution and Pennsylvania avenues. Behind them came 400 infantrymen, followed up by tanks and armored vehicles. The soldiers donned gas masks and, without warning, began hurling gas grenades at the veterans. The troops advanced, some jabbing with bayonets.
It's war. The greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
I knew something was going to happen, that they might be attacked. And I had a press card, so I passed the police lines, and then I saw the soldiers advancing into the camp. And when confronted with this, the men all stood there and said, "Stand firm as long as you can." And they started throwing tear gas.
The tear gas was just burning my face. I was trailing behind my dad, and he kept hollering, "Come on, boy, come on, boy."
Marchers were choking from the gas, just like the battlefields in France.
And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States.
I'd never seen anything like it. They systematically went down the line, burned up all the tents and all the possessions of the people there. I was thinking of Herbert Hoover when this happened, because his election was in 3 months. I thought this would be the finish of Hoover.
The orders of the President must be obeyed, and the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army in the shadow of the beautiful dome of the Capitol of the United States of America.
But the chaos of clearing out the camping areas of the bonus army men from downtown Washington was only the beginning that awful day. Although Big Mac's orders had been to just assist the D.C. police in quelling the disturbance in the city and removing the squatters from the buildings and grounds along Pennsylvania Avenue, he had a much more complete plan for his troops. He planned to put a total end to the bonus army by invading the Marks camp across the river, driving out all the occupants, and destroying it. By 9 p.m., the troops were stationed at the bridge, ready to cross into the camp. Realizing what was about to happen, a veteran came dashing across the bridge, waving a white shirt for a flag of truce, and begged for time to evacuate the women and children. MacArthur granted the request. Some historians say he gave them an hour. Some report it was 20 minutes. Either way, it was horrific. Eyewitnesses later said that Secretary of War Hurley, speaking for the president, forbade troops from crossing the bridge into the bonus army camp on the Anacostia Flats. At least 2 high-ranking officers were sent by Hurley to convey these orders to MacArthur. Ike later wrote, "MacArthur said he was too busy and did not want either himself or his staff bothered by people coming down and pretending to bring orders." And so, ignoring Hoover's orders, Big Mac sent the troops storming over the bridge. Their bayonets were fixed to brandish at resistors, and they lobbed tear gas as they pushed forward through the camp. Panic ensued as the veterans were routed, and their makeshift Hooverville, with all their pathetic personal possessions, was torched. By morning, virtually nothing was left. Once again, to help get a bit more of a feel of the tragedy of the events, here is more newsreel footage from 1932.
All through the camp were scenes of panic.
My dad says, "Let's get the hell out of here. The soldiers are going to kill us."
Then troops began to set fire to their wooden shacks. One reporter wrote, "The blaze was so big it lit the whole sky. A nightmare come to life." The president looked out a window of the White House in the direction of the fire, then retired for the night.
And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army that ends so disastrously in the shadow of the Capitol of the United States of America.
That morning, one of the veterans returned to the barren site where George Patton was inspecting the grounds. He wanted to talk to General Patton. His name was Joe Angelo, and although unassuming looking, he was a real hero of World War I. Angelo had been an orderly with the 304th Tank Brigade in France, commanded by future General George S. Patton. During one battle, Patton was seriously wounded by a machine gun and lying in an exposed area. Angelo showed great courage under enemy fire and dragged Patton to safety, undoubtedly saving his life that day. In the spring of 1919, an interview appeared in American newspapers in which Patton declared Angelo without doubt the bravest man in the American Army. I have never seen his equal. Evidently, Patton changed his mind that morning in July 1932. Angelo approached him on the Anacostia Flats, and all Patton could do was turn to an aide and say, "I do not know this man. Take him away, and under no circumstances permit him to return." He later admitted privately that indeed he did remember Angelo, and he and his mother had even helped Angelo financially at times in the past, but it wouldn't have looked good if headlines and stories about the meeting between the two of them at the scene of the ignominious Bonus Army horror had hit the newspapers. Public reactions to the aftermath of the Bonus Army destruction were mixed. Senators Hugo Black, Democrat of Alabama, William Borah, Republican of Idaho, and Hiram Johnson, Republican of California, were outraged at the Army's behavior. Representative Fiorello LaGuardia, Republican of New York, sent a telegram to Hoover in which he stated, "Soup is cheaper than tear gas bombs, and bread is better than bullets in maintaining law and order in these times of depression, unemployment, and hunger." In Albany, Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR was New York governor at the time, read the reports of the Army's assault on the bonus marchers with horror. Professor Rexford G. Tugwell, a Roosevelt confidant, was spending the night in the governor's mansion. Roosevelt called him into the governor's bedroom. Roosevelt confessed that he had once promoted Hoover for president and now regretted that act. "There is nothing inside the man but jelly," Roosevelt angrily said. Why didn't Hoover offer the men coffee and sandwiches instead of turning Pat Hurley and Doug MacArthur loose? Roosevelt said he might feel sorry for the spineless Hoover if he didn't feel worse for the Bonus Army men and their families now tramping on the roads and railways. Most newspapers, like the New York Times, supported Hoover and MacArthur's actions. MacArthur was praised for averting revolution, but never firing a shot. Yet the Washington News newspaper declared, "If the Army must be called out to make war on unarmed citizens, this is no longer America." The next day, the War Department declared that almost none of the bonus marchers had been veterans. Hoover later described the Bonus Army as a mixture of hoodlums, ex-convicts, and communists. The angry governor of Pennsylvania said that this was an outright lie. Nearly all of them were veterans, and 2/3 had served overseas during the Great War. Over the next few weeks, the B&O Railroad, which had once denied travel to the Bonus Army, now helped disperse them across the country again. Later investigations did conclude that the vast majority of the men were just what they claimed to be, veterans of the Great War, down on their luck and needing a helping hand in the form of the bonus that they felt their service to the nation had earned. As they often pointed out, in 1918 they had come home heroes, but in 1932 they were just cast-offs. In 1918, nothing was too good for them to show the country's gratitude for their sacrifice. In 1932, nothing was what they got. Notice Hoover's explanation. He brought out the communist ogre once again. From his perspective, all the hubbub of the Bonus Army was just invented by the commies to threaten U.S. democracy. It couldn't be that tens of thousands of veterans were at their wits' end how to keep their families from starving. It couldn't be that they really did just want the bonuses they had earned in the trenches of Europe in the Great War, to help them through the devastation of a Great Depression that they had done nothing themselves to create. No, according to Hoover and many conservatives in the government, that was just a ruse. They really wanted to overthrow the government in a Bolshevik-style revolution. Yes, such a threat. 25,000 or so emaciated, exhausted, disheartened men, many with families in tow, with almost no belongings, and no weapons other than rocks and stones, against the fully equipped military might of the United States Army. Quite a devilishly clever communist plot, eh? there some communist agitators more than willing to show up and stir the pot in this situation? Of course there were. But once again, as in the first Red Scare of the post-World War I era, the answer to fending off their efforts of persuasion would have been for the U.S. government and American industry to actually be honestly, openly working toward immediate solutions to the dire poverty and starvation in the country, and honestly and openly working on creative, long-term solutions to solve the economic problems that led to the stock market crash, the bank failures, and the Depression in the first place. The effective answer to incursions by communist ideas should not have been mostly turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to the suffering all around, putting the blame for bad publicity on the communists, spouting platitudes about things turning around soon, evidently by some miraculous unseen hand of the marketplace intervening, or something. But that was what Hoover chose to do, and that approach lost him the 1932 election 4 months after the rout of the Bonus Army. During his presidential campaign in 1928, Republican Party campaign literature claimed that if Herbert Hoover won, there would be a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. That election was less than a year before the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. It wasn't long before the reality was that many Americans found their cars repossessed, and eventually their homes and garages too. As for the chickens, for millions of Americans, the only time they had chicken was when lining up for chicken soup at the soup kitchens that sprang up everywhere during those desperate times. By the summer of 1932, Hoover had had almost 3 years to do something, anything to relieve the crushing, mind-numbing, relentless poverty and despair in the country. The evidence was that he had no workable ideas at all, just pious platitudes, like this one. While in office, Hoover had a favorite catchphrase, rugged individualism. It was a significant part of his answer to the crisis of the Depression. It refers to the idea that there is no need at all for government intervention in the economic lives of individuals, nor in the economics of the nation. Each individual should be able to help themselves out. But the Bonus Army fiasco made it painfully obvious that in a complex, huge society like the USA, there were times when no matter how rugged many individuals were, there was no way for them to go it alone. Many of those veterans of the Bonus Army were very rugged individuals. They had survived fighting in the trenches of the most horrific war in history. Most wanted nothing more than a chance to work hard at a job, any job, to support their struggling or starving families. But they were unable to make jobs appear out of thin air. So, the Republican Party's efforts in public relations to attempt to get Herbert re-elected were pretty pitiful, as you can see by these campaign buttons from that year. There is no question that the ideas of Franklin Roosevelt for dealing with the Depression through introducing a New Deal in the coming years would end up being very controversial in some circles. But coming up to the election of 1932, a majority of the voting public became convinced anything would be better than Hoover and the proliferation of Hoovervilles. FDR got 23 million votes to Hoover's 16 million, and he pretty much swept the Electoral College, as you can see by this map. As for the Bonus Army, FDR chose a different way to deal with some of the same men in the first year of his presidency. In March 1933, just barely into FDR's first term, some bonus marchers began drifting back into Washington, as they had found no employment and no hope back where they came from. By May, a tent city had sprung up with about 3,000 inhabitants. FDR had ordered the army to set up the camp in an abandoned fort on the outskirts of Washington. At one point, in a visit arranged by the White House, the nation's new First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, made her way through mud and rain to join the vets in a sing-along. As one veteran put it, Hoover sent the army. Roosevelt sent his wife. Roosevelt wasn't in favor at that point of paying the bonuses yet, because even the U.S. Treasury was in dire straits as a result of the Depression. But as an alternative, he offered the men jobs in his new Civilian Conservation Corps program. The Corps normally accepted only unmarried men under 25, but FDR signed an executive order allowing 25,000 World War I vets, including married men, to enroll in the program. Oh, and in 1936, with Democrats holding a majority in both houses, an act authorizing the payment of the World War I bonuses finally passed. The reason I share this bonus army story at this point in the Strange Brew series is to provide a vivid example of the dark realities of the era of the Great Depression, and to show how the specter of the threat of communism, promoted by the government and the mass media, made its way from the period of the Red Scare of 1919, past the relatively prosperous Roaring Twenties, and on into the depths of the economic disaster of the 30s. Because it is ultimately this focus on the Russian-birthed communist ogre that leads us onward down the path to the coalescing of the wildly diverse evangelical religious crowd that has formed around the 45th president that I have dubbed Donald Trump's strangest bedfellows, and that has strangely led to Republican politicians and pundits throwing around the label communist in an attempt to slander some 21st century Americans. In 1932, Hoover used the bonus army crisis to jumpstart that ogre of communism that had been slumbering during the Roaring Twenties. During the period of the first Red Scare in 1919, and again in the period of the early Depression, you may have noticed that American business and governmental authorities raised the specter of the communist ogre in terms of what was essentially referred to as class war. There was concern that the poor in America, the workers in the mines and mills and factories, would finally decide to rise up and take a piece of the prosperity pie they had always been denied. Up until the early 1900s, any attempts of those in the lower class to try to obtain even minor improvements in their lot by means of strikes and demonstrations had always been quelled all too often through threats, intimidation, and violence by police, state militias, and federal troops. But after the Russian Revolution, there was a fear that outside agitators, Bolsheviks, communists, anarchists, might embolden the downtrodden and organize them to engage in some more widespread efforts. The peasants in Russia had not been part of the Bolshevik Revolution because they had all read the works of Marx and Engels and agreed with a collection of economic and historical theories introduced by those men. They were just fed up with a system in which a few at the top of Russian society enjoyed great prosperity, while the vast majority lived grueling lives of bleakness and hopelessness. There wasn't even that big of a middle class in Russia at the time, nor even the kind of self-made robber barons that the American capitalist system had fostered. Circumstances there were almost still a holdover from feudal times. But with agitation by a relatively small group of organized, zealous intellectuals such as Lenin, those peasants and workers were able to be formed into a force that could topple a dynasty that had lasted for centuries and take command of a gigantic nation, all based on the anger of the masses against economic inequality. Likewise, there is no indication that the average poor American worker of the early 1900s would be likely to be lured to read the writings of Marx or Engels either. But they were equally subject to vast economic inequalities in the U.S., such as between the men and young boys doing back-breaking, body and soul-destroying work in the mines for barely enough income to keep their families from starving, and the fabulously wealthy men who owned the mines, who lived in mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York. Thus, it was logical for the business and political leaders in the U.S. to be concerned that such inequality was likely stirring up anger in the hearts of many of the American poor. The original Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 was based on a fear of communist agitators coming in and prodding the industrial workers of the U.S. into staging a revolution similar to that which had turned Russian society upside down. The feared scenario was that they would take over the mines and mills and factories, vanquish the capitalist system, and continue on to take over the federal and state governments, establishing a communist government like that of Lenin in Russia. With the failure of the Palmer raids to expose any such massive coordinated plan by communists, the fear of such a takeover by the workers of America faded. It was replaced in the minds of the middle and upper classes for a time with enthusiasm for the relative prosperity of the Roaring Twenties. The collapse of that prosperity by the early 1930s and the failure of the capitalist system to fend off the Great Depression led to renewed fears that maybe now outside communist agitators would once again swoop in and stir up both the hungry workers and the huge numbers of the jobless men to foment that revolution. The fact that bonus army marchers came from all over America to converge on the nation's capital seemed ominous to some government leaders, including the president, and their fears were spread via the mass media of the time to the masses. The miserable end to the bonus army's efforts should have made it obvious that outside communist agitators were not really as prevalent as suspected, nor organized and equipped to foment a workers' revolution. But the communist ogre had been jump-started again, all ready to be pressed into service to explain any and all situations of unrest in the country, from strikes and public demonstrations in the streets of the cities, eventually to civil rights agitation. This communist ogre of the mid-1930s was one that was presented as a dangerous force tearing at peace and order in society. It was invoked over and over by the forces of capitalism and government to scare the middle and upper classes into having a negative view of any attempt by any groups to advocate for relief from inequities in the society. But as the 1930s continued on, the communist ogre was given what you might think of as a face transplant. In 1919, A. Mitchell Palmer was sure that there was some sort of huge underground force of communist organizers who could spring out of the shadows and foment a nationwide revolution at any moment. In 1932, associates of Herbert Hoover seemed to have a similar fear. But just because these fears proved mostly unfounded, that doesn't mean that some communist ideas were not a continuing threat to the capitalist system of the country. This led to a gradual shift in emphasis in anti-communist concerns in the country. As mentioned in an earlier episode of the series, by the mid-1930s, the industrialists and other big business leaders in the country were struggling mightily to figure out how to shake off their reputation among the American populace as being the ones, along with the big bankers, who caused the Depression, and to shake off the perspective that many people were coming to that unfettered capitalism might not be the genie that would bring unending prosperity after all. Yes, many people were coming to an understanding that there really were other options for how a country's economy could be run, including socialism and communism. What if, thought the big businessmen, a majority of the populace began demanding changes that would threaten their splendiferous lifestyles? Their first attempt to deal with this threat was to try to use advertising to sell the idea of how great capitalism was, how prosperous it had made the nation, how tied it was to democracy itself, why they insisted capitalism is an integral part of the very nature of the American way. This claim was kind of hollow in the midst of the Great Depression, but it was all they had to work with. They could only hope that the majority of Americans would buy their claims that the Depression was only a blip in American history and that the capitalist system, if left to its own devices, unhindered by governmental regulation, would arise again to save the day very soon. As also mentioned in an earlier episode, when this advertising effort did not yield the results hoped for, those big businessmen came up with the idea of enlisting the clergymen of America to be their salesmen, starting with nationally known big-name preachers such as James Fifield, known as the Apostle to Millionaires, and eventually including local pastors from cities and towns all across America. Back at that time, American Christian preachers and pastors in general had a much more solid reputation for integrity and much more respect from the average citizen than many do now. So it was a smart move. But what could persuade all those clergymen that capitalism was as much in their interest, in the interest of the spread of Christianity, as it was in the interest of big business? There is an aspect of the answer to that question that we haven't explored up to this point. You get the first hint of it on those billboards put up by the National Association of Manufacturers. Notice what the American way is described as on these billboards. It could have been described as comprised of three things: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But no, it was almost always comprised of four things. First was representative democracy. That makes sense, given that the founders wanted to get away from the monarchies of the old world. Second was opportunity. Opportunity for what? Well, it never says, but the strong implication is opportunity to prosper financially, if you work hard, of course. Not that this made much sense to men grinding away in mines and factories for years and years for minimal wages. Any real opportunity to realize the American dream for themselves was a fleeting illusion, but it looked good on a billboard. Third was always private enterprise. They were smart enough not to use the real words for what they meant, unfettered capitalism, but chose this euphemism instead. But don't mistake what the purpose of including this phrase was. These billboards were not to just promote capitalism, but to inoculate viewers against being tempted by possible seduction by the communist Ogre. For you see, by this time the Ogre was being given a makeover, acquiring a new face. We see some of the first glimpses of this new face on these billboards when we come to the fourth pillar of the American way, freedom. But a very specific application of the word freedom. Yes, they gave lip service to the freedom of speech. But I've recently come to understand that the most important phrase on this billboard was actually freedom of religion, for a very specific reason, one that I did not expect. You've likely heard of Dwight Eisenhower's comments about what he dubbed the United States military-industrial complex in his farewell speech to the nation in 1961. Here they are in his own words.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
"26 years later, George Kennan, former U.S. ambassador to the USSR during Ike's presidency, wrote in his preface to Norman Cousins' 1987 book, The Pathology of Power, "Were the Soviet Union to sink tomorrow under the waters of the ocean, the American military-industrial complex would have to remain substantially unchanged until some other adversary could be invented. Anything else would be an unacceptable shock to the American economy." But there is another United States complex I had never heard of until recently. After months of studying the history leading up to the strange brew that swirls around Donald Trump, I came to some tentative theories of how all the historical pieces were fitting together. I wondered if I was just reading into some of the factors, some trends that weren't really there. And then a short time ago, I found this book. The Spiritual Industrial Complex: America's Religious Battle Against Communism in the Early Cold War. As I began reading, I was startled to find that the author was covering many of the same individuals, trends, and events that I had been including in my studies and in these videos. But he had added a wealth of documentation I had been totally unaware of, and much of it confirmed and expanded the conclusions I'd been coming to. He had coined the phrase spiritual industrial complex as a shorthand way of referring to these factors. In this and upcoming Strange Brew episodes, I'll be sharing some of his documentation and clarify what he meant by that term. If you ever read much about the Red Scare era of the late 1940s through the 1960s, you've no doubt come across the name of the House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC. The HUAC investigated allegations that influential American citizens, including government employees and famous entertainers, were or had been active in the Communist Party in America. For instance, at the height of the popularity of the I Love Lucy show in 1953, it became a big news story that Lucy was under investigation for an alleged involvement with communism. A 1936 document was produced in her own handwriting that showed she had declared her intent to vote that year for someone running as a communist. Luckily, she was able to convince the HUAC that she had just been a naive 25-year-old woman at the time who knew nothing substantive about the Communist Party at the time, but merely signed the paper under prodding from her overbearing grandfather, an avowed socialist. But many Hollywood actors, directors, and writers, along with entertainers in other fields such as music, were not so lucky when quizzed by the HUAC. The careers of many in the entertainment industries were stalled or totally ruined when they were blacklisted by the powers that be in the entertainment business for allegedly having communist ties. I'd read about these matters before over the years, but I had never focused on the fact that the HUAC wasn't something new. I guess I'd always assumed that Russia was our ally in World War II, so anti-communism didn't really exist out in the open in the U.S. during those years, and that only after the war ended and Russia turned on us and developed its own atomic weapons and began threatening the U.S., did anti-communism become a hot topic. I thus thought that the HUAC was formed as an outgrowth of that new rival relationship with Russia. I've since learned how wrong I was. I was unaware that the HUAC actually was formed in 1938 under the leadership of this man, Martin Dies, a Democratic congressman from Texas. It first functioned under the name Special Committee to Investigate Un-American Activities, often nicknamed the Dies Committee. The creation of the HUAC in 1938 was obviously before the introduction of the atomic bomb at the end of 1945, so there was no concern yet that Russians were stealing our atomic secrets and planning to militarily take over America. If there was a communist ogre that was being used to blame for problems in American society by the late 1930s, what was the new nature attributed to that ogre? Here is our first hint of it from Herzog's book. In 1940, Martin Dies published The Trojan Horse in America, a detailed and at times eloquent warning against communism geared toward average citizens. Like the witnesses called before his committee, Dies discussed in depth the communist hostility toward religion, noting that in the USSR there is no room for God. But Dies went a step beyond merely cataloging the reasons for communist incompatibility with religion. He argued that communism was a powerful religion itself. Dies began his book by recalling the siege of Troy, an illusion popular with communists. In 1935, at the 7th World Congress in Moscow, Comintern Secretary Georgy Dimitrov called upon his comrades to adopt a strategy akin to that of the Greeks. Rather than employing force, communists would use cunning and subtlety to achieve victory. Dies, too, recognized the Trojan horse as the ultimate symbol of communism, but he took the metaphor one step further. Dies recalled that not only was the horse considered a gift, but the Trojans were convinced it was an object worthy of their religious veneration, an excellent substitute for the image of their goddess Pallas. It was appropriate to recall at this point, Dies asserted, that communism works to make its philosophy of dialectical materialism a substitute for religion. Not through arms or force, but through insidious psychological invasion would the communists bore their way into the soul of America, accomplishing what armies could not. Given this construction of communism, Dies' conclusion was inescapable and significant. Americans had to fight faith with faith. By displacing God as the center of morality, communism threatened to reinstate a jungle code of ethics, with men as the masters of their own destinies. For Dies, Judeo-Christianity offered the best possible counter to the grotesque illusion of communism, since it rested on 4 essential moral propositions: God as the grantor of freedom and sustenance, a respect for individuals because they are created in God's image, God is the only basis for a just and peaceful society, and a belief in spiritual rather than material forces. That same year, in a series of articles on HUAC, Dies was blunter and less inclusive of other faiths. The real answer, he wrote, lies in the restoration of Christian influence in America. The irreconcilable conflict between the teachings of Christ and Marx is the issue upon which the future of Western civilization is staked. Simply put, religion became part of the Cold War solution for America's public servants. Starting at the top with the president, on Christmas Eve, 1950, Truman gave a speech to the nation broadcast on radio. Here is the conclusion of that speech.
Many of us are fortunate enough to celebrate Christmas at our own fireside. But there are many others who are away from their homes and loved ones on this day. Thousands of our boys are on the cold and dreary battlefield of Korea. But all of us, at home, at war, wherever we may be, are within reach of God's love and power. We can all pray. All of us should pray. We should ask the fulfillment of God's will. We should ask for courage, for wisdom, for the quietness of soul which comes alone to them who place their lives in his hands. We should pray for a peace which is based on righteousness. The nation already is in the midst of a crusade of prayer. On the last Sunday of the old year, there will be special services devoted to a revival of faith in God. I call upon all of you to enlist in this common cause. I call upon you no matter what your spiritual allegiance may be. We're all joined in the fight against the tyranny of communism. Communism is godless. Democracy is the foundation of faith. Faith in oneself, faith in one's neighbors, faith in God. Democracy's most powerful weapon is not a gun, a tank, or a bomb. It is faith. Faith in the brotherhood and dignity of man under God.
And it wasn't just politicians. Here's a 1952 ad that was in Life magazine, created by Conrad Hilton for his Hilton Hotels. But the ad's content isn't about the amenities of Conrad's hotels. It is a prayer, introducing the prayer as a comment, likely by Hilton himself, declaring, "America on its knees, not beaten there by the hammer and sickle, but freely, intelligently, responsibly, confidently, powerfully. America now knows it can destroy communism and win the battle for peace. We need fear nothing or no one except God." Yes, Hilton's ads in this time period evidently often included prayers. His conviction that religious faith was a critical part of America's battle against communism was well publicized. In 1956, an article in the trade magazine Sales Management, the Magazine of Marketing, noted, "The recent rise of Hilton International has coincided with Conrad Hilton's personal fight against communism." Indeed, Conrad Hilton regularly substituted prayers for advertisements. Hilton was a passionate Catholic. He also had respect for other religions, working closely with Jews and Muslims. He abominated atheists and demonized communists. He believed his hotels made a significant contribution to America's struggle against communism in the Cold War. The communist ogre wasn't just a foe of the capitalist economic system and political system of the United States. Much more important, it was a foe of God. And thus, by the 1950s, Americans were regularly admonished that they could not just sit back while their government dealt with communism by building and maintaining a powerful military-industrial complex. Each American was called to be enlisted as a spiritual soldier, ready to fight a holy war. And they were to get ready not by donning armor and getting a sword and shield, or even by buying guns and ammo, but by praying and going to church. Here's a billboard from that era that pretty much says it all. In the next episode of the Strange Brew Series, we will discover more about the spiritual industrial complex and how it joined the military-industrial complex after World War II in order to combat the ogre of godless communism. Stay tuned for Pitchforks and Torches time.